which you'll find on page 100 in the Bibles in the pew, and then from Romans chapter 12, which is on page 200 in the New Testament section. So page 100 and page 200, though that's not why I chose them. Leviticus chapter 1, verse 1. The Lord called to Moses from the tent of the Lord's presence and gave him the following instructions for the Israelites to observe when they offer their sacrifices. When anyone offers an animal sacrifice, it may be one of his cattle or one of his sheep or goats. If he's offering one of his cattle as a burnt offering, he must bring a bull without any defects. He must present it at the entrance of the tent of the Lord's presence so that the Lord will accept him. The man shall put his hand on its head, and it will be accepted as a sacrifice to take away sins. He shall kill the bull there, and the Aaronite priest shall present the blood to the Lord, and then throw it against all four sides of the altar, which is at the entrance of the tent. Then he shall skin the animal and cut it up, and the priest shall arrange firewood on the altar and light it. They shall put on the fire the pieces of the animal, including the head and the fat. The man must wash the internal organs and hind legs, and the officiating priest will burn the whole sacrifice on the altar. The smell of this food offering is pleasing to the Lord. Romans chapter 12. So then, my brothers and sisters, because of God's great mercy to us, I appeal to you. Offer yourselves as a living sacrifice to God, dedicated to his service and pleasing to him. This is the true worship that you should offer. Do not conform yourselves to the standards of this world, but let God transform you inwardly by a complete change of your mind. Then you will be able to know the will of God, what is good, pleasing to him, and perfect. The word can refer to a number, it can refer to a Chinese character, or it can refer to a political viewpoint. Although on the third of those contexts, sadly, it often has a very negative idea, that of being extreme and willing to use violence. The word is radical. But the real meaning of the word radical simply means to go back to the root or the origin. It means to go back to the basics, the fundamentals. It's something that is far-reaching, something that is thorough, something that is extensive. And Jesus calls us to radical discipleship. To be radical in getting rid of sin, to be radical in thoroughgoing holiness. The story is told of a man many years ago who was walking along the side of the beach. And as he did so, he was watching people. And noticing two who were fishermen, he went over to them and he simply said, "Follow me." And in response to Jesus' words, the two disciples got up. They left their nets and they started to follow him. That is radical discipleship. To be a disciple is simply to be under the teaching and the discipline of a teacher or a master. And radical is to get to the root of things, to find the first or the starting point. And when Jesus calls us to get to the root of discipleship, he calls for us to place everything upon the altar. Just as we were reading in Romans 12 there, in view of the mercies of God, present your bodies as living sacrifices. That's the call to discipleship from Jesus. There's no pick and mix here, as some of us used to remember at the sweetie counter in Willis. We cannot choose those areas that we would like to give to him and those areas that we would like to keep hold of ourselves. Radical discipleship means the presenting of our bodies as living sacrifices. But notice what he says first. In view of God's mercies. That's where we need to begin. How just perfect in terms of timing that we should be celebrating communion this morning. And that incredible sacrifice of our Lord for us. And Paul is saying there is going to be no radical discipleship unless we keep in view, unless we keep at the forefront of our minds the mercies of God. But notice how he addresses them. Brothers and sisters, it's a word of kindness. He's not above them. He's not superior to them. He is one of them. And what he's actually saying to them, in effect, is, come on. It's like that huddle in the center circle before the start of the match, where the teams stand with their arms around each other's shoulders, and one person is going to say some words to inspire them to give everything that they've got. And that's Paul here. But before he calls them to that offering of themselves, he reminds them one more time of the mercies of the Lord. Why should they listen to his call to radical discipleship? Why should they place all upon the altar? Isn't it a bit extreme? The answer is simply in view of the mercies of God. And Paul uses the plural word there. Now, it might possibly mean the mercy or the character of God. But because it's in the plural form, the mercies of God, I think it refers to the many acts of God's kindness toward us. And the use of the word in the plural is deliberate. If we are going to respond to the call of totally giving ourselves to the Lord, then we must keep in view the mercies of God. It's like that psalm says, bless the Lord, O my soul, and all that is within me. Bless his holy name. Bless the Lord, O my soul, and do not forget all his benefits. We could say, do not forget his mercies. Because when we forget, that's when we become ungrateful. When we forget, that's when we grow soft on sin. When we forget, is when we face the danger of becoming half-hearted. But if we keep in view the mercies of God, then that will be that motivation, that driving force to truly be the radical disciples that Jesus calls us to be. Because look at what the call is. It's to present our bodies as living sacrifices to God. And there were two thoughts in terms of that word there, to present ourselves. The first is that we simply place ourselves at God's disposal. We see the same word used in Matthew 26. Jesus is in the Garden of Gethsemane. He's been praying. And then the crowd come. And one member of the crowd steps forward, Judas, and betrays him with a kiss. And at that point, seeing things are getting a little difficult here, one of Jesus' disciples draws his sword. And Jesus says, whoa, stop. That's enough. Or don't you understand that my Father in heaven, if I ask, will make more than 12 legions of angels available to me? He will present them to me. And to present ourselves to God is to say, Lord, I'm available. Whatever you want, whenever you want, and wherever you want. Are we at his disposal? Is our time at his disposal? Is our work an offering of worship to him? Is our money at his disposal? Are our gifts and our talents there for him, whatever he chooses to do with us and with them? To present ourselves is to make ourselves available. And secondly, it is to devote or to dedicate or to consecrate ourselves to God, whichever of those three words you like the sound of best. And we see that word too in operation in Luke chapter 2. Jesus' mother, Mary, and Joseph, on the 8th day after he has been born, take him to the temple and present him to the Lord. It's an act of thanksgiving, but it's also an act of dedication and of devotion. So that's what it is to present ourselves to God. It's to make ourselves available, and it's to devote ourselves to whatever he wants. So why on earth did we read from Leviticus chapter 1? What on earth has that got to do with Romans chapter 12? I think it has everything to do with Romans 12. It's an illustration of that giving of our whole selves. Did you notice in Leviticus 1 that every part of this sacrifice was to be placed upon the altar and burnt for the glory and the honor of God? Now that was not so with every sacrifice. The sacrifice known as the peace or the fellowship offering, part of it was burned upon the altar, part of it was eaten. But in the burnt offering, everything was placed upon the altar. And this is what they did. First of all, they would lay hands upon the animal. That means that they're saying to God, this animal now represents me. This animal takes my place. And it's offered to God instead of them, because if they're put upon the altar and burned, then that's the end of their life in this world. But what they are wanting is to express to God they're willing to put everything at his disposal and to be devoted to him. And so they place their hands upon an animal and say, Lord, just as this animal is being given to you in its entirety, so I and my life is here for you. Now, the animal then has to be cut into pieces. Now, that may simply be a very practical thing. I don't know if you're aware, but the altar would have been about this high. So can you imagine trying to lift a whole sheep or a whole bull and get it up chest high? Not very easy, even if there are several of you. So it may just have been a very practical thing. But this morning, I'd like us to think about the pieces of our lives. How do we divide our time? How do we use the different gifts and abilities God has given to us? Or thinking about the people that we are and that God has made us. You know, whether it's that we're patient or understanding or hospitable or considerate. All of those we need to bring and place upon the altar. Because in the burnt offering, everything is placed on the altar. And thinking of this week, I was reminded of the words of an old hymn. Take my life and let it be consecrated, Lord, to thee. Now, in the 19th century, I don't know if Frances Ridley Havergal had in her thoughts the words of Leviticus 1, but she certainly does cut up the parts of our life in order to offer them to the Lord. Take my hands, she said, and let them move, the impulse of your love. Will you give your hands to the Lord this morning? Will you give to him everything that you're going to do this week? And ask the Lord, how can my actions show love to others? In the place that I live, in the place where I work, and in my local community. Well, then she says, Lord, take my feet, and let them be swift and beautiful for thee. Clearly she has in mind Isaiah 57. How lovely on the mountains are the feet of those who bring good news. However, if there's one job I wouldn't want, I don't fancy being a podiatrist. Spending my working life looking at and touching people's feet does not appeal. If it's a little baby that needs a bath, then that's okay. Wrap them in a towel and cuddle them, and feet will probably dry themselves inside the towel. If it's perhaps some occasion we wash one another's feet and we're just scooping a little bit of water over somebody's feet, well, that's just about doable with a blindfold and a peg. You see, the thing with feet is they get sweaty and they get smelly and they've got little bits of dried skin between the toes. And yet, Isaiah says they're beautiful. Well, they are when they're the feet of people who are bringing good news. Will you present your feet to the Lord this morning? Lord, to whom can I bring a word of hope this week? Lord, when I'm in my workplace, when I go there, is there a word of encouragement I can give to someone? Lord, as I live with my family or my friends, are there words of compassion that I can share? She then goes on to talk about her voice and her lips. Because, Lord, yes, I want to sing your praise, but I also want my lips to be filled with messages from you. So not harsh words, unkind, condemning of others, but rather words of kindness and care and help. Well, most of that's not too bad. I think we can go with some of that, but the first two lines of the next verse is the really tricky bit. Take my silver and my gold, not a mite would I withhold. We know the story of the widow with her two little mites, don't we? The two little coins, the least value of anything. And here we're actually daring to ask God to take charge of our finances. Not just that we will give something and then we look after the rest, but we actually say, Lord, you can be in charge of the whole lot. And if you say to me, give here, then I give. Lord, if you say to me, increase my giving by £5 a week, my answer is, but Lord, my income hasn't gone up by £5 a month. We're saying, Lord, it's yours. You have the right to it. And the writer goes on to talk about intellect, her will, her love, and so on. And in that sense, this hymn seems to, as it were, to keep the analogy, cut up and divide the parts of our lives. Or perhaps we should say, helps us to work out in practical terms what the verse is saying. Take my life and let it be consecrated, Lord, to thee. Because that's the burnt offering. That's what Paul is writing here. That's the call to radical discipleship. To present our bodies as living sacrifices. Only that's a contradiction in terms, really. You can't have a living sacrifice. Either the animal lives or it is a sacrifice. But it can't be both. You have to choose. Either you keep the animal or you surrender it. Either we keep our lives or we offer it to the Lord in radical discipleship. Because to present our bodies is simply, in the light of Leviticus 1, to present me, all that I have, and all that I am. My body, my thoughts, my desires, my abilities, my energies, my powers, me as a whole person. And as Paul will have said in Romans 6, no longer present the parts of your body for unrighteousness, but present them to God for what is righteous. Whether that be feet to bring good news, hands to act kindly, or a tongue to speak blessing. But how is that possible? We asked the question earlier, didn't we? Isn't that a bit too much? Don't we feel a little bit like the rich young ruler to whom Jesus says, go and sell everything you've got, give it to the poor, and then you can begin to come and follow me? That's why Paul says, in view of God's mercies. Only when we keep in view the mercies of God can we hear his call to radical discipleship. To live out every day totally devoted to him in everything. Only when we keep in view the mercies of God can we offer up our lives in spirit and in truth for his praise and for his glory. But may God help us to do so. Amen.